Good evening, everyone. I'm Lisa Krasner, President at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight for Indigenous Identity, Diplomacy and Sovereignty in the American Revolution with Dr. Lorén Spears and Dr. Christian DeLucia. The Massachusetts Historical Society is committed to hosting programs that bring erased stories to light, and during the coming months, commemorate the 250th anniversary of America's founding. Tonight's program will foreground experiences of Indigenous families and nations in the American Revolution. This evening's panelists are experts in the decisions Northeastern tribal nations and people made to support their nation's sovereignty and interests from fighting to diplomacy. I'm thrilled to introduce them. Lorén Spears, enrolled Narragansett tribal citizen and executive director of Tamaqua Museum, holds a master's in education and received a Doctor of Humane Letters from the University of Rhode Island for her dedicated work. She is author, artist, and curator, and she founded New Watuan School and the Indigenous Empowerment Center. Christine DeLucia is Associate Professor of History at Williams College. She is author of Memory Lands, King Philip's War and the Place of Violence in the Northeast, which received the Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize from the MHS in 2019. She is currently completing her second book, The Itineraries, Families and Freedom Journeys in the Revolutionary Northeast. So I'll now pass it to Dr. Spears to begin and invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
I believe Christine was actually going first, so I'm just going to say hello to everyone.
Thank you to the Massachusetts Historical Society for hosting this program and offering this opportunity for conversation. I especially appreciate Lorén Spears being here with us this evening to share some of her work with the Tamaqua Museum, and I'm glad to be in dialogue with her this evening. I'd like to begin by recognizing that I live and work as an early American historian in the homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee community. This sovereign tribal nation has long cared for and interpreted its lands and histories, including the close involvement of tribal citizens in the American Revolution. They have been producing powerful museum exhibitions, walking tours, digital maps, publications, and many other resources that tell about ancestors' experiences and connect them to the present day. These experiences include the nation's move westward in the immediate wake of the Revolutionary War to New York and then Wisconsin as colonial dispossession of their lands escalated in the East. This takes me to the first point I want to make in this brief presentation, which is that Native nations across the Northeast and North America continuously engage in knowledge sovereignty, the caretaking and transmission of their own cultural heritage. Today, that takes many forms, including documentaries, such as this terrific film titled Up and Down the River, produced by the Mohegan tribe about ancestors' involvement in the American Revolution. And I encourage everyone here this evening to seek out and spend time with resources like these. Native nations and people have always recalled and reflected upon their experiences in the American Revolution and the complex alliances and strategies that they undertook in a time of tremendous upheaval. These practices of memory are important counterpoints to many mainstream works of American history and entertainment that have often downplayed or erased or misrepresented these realities in favor of more simplistic accounts of the United States origins. And if you've ever seen the musical Hamilton, you might be interested in some of the strong critiques about the way it erases Indigenous people and nations. And here are two, one from Cherokee scholar Adrienne Keene, and a reference to playwright Ishmael Reed's The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda. Even prominent U.S. historian Jill Lepore miscast these histories in her book, These Truths, asserting in a brief line that nearly all Native people were loyalists or allies of the British. As I'll discuss today, this is untrue. When I was thinking about where to begin this evening, I think the foundational point to make here is that the United States does not emerge in a vacuum. To the contrary, hundreds of Native nations across the continent already existed and governed themselves in the era that the United States came into being. These many sovereign polities are the framework for everything that followed and for our realities in the 21st century. Native leaders and citizens maintained countless generations of governance traditions, diplomacy and alliance building, and protecting cherished lands and waters where they intended to live in the future. Indigenous diplomacy and political principles established and shaped the terms on which European colonizers arrived and moved on this continent. To take one example, the Guswenta or Turo Wampum has long served as a guiding principle for peace, friendship, and self-determination among Haudenosaunee nations and the larger Haudenosaunee Confederacy in their interactions with the Dutch and then British powers. The wampum belt, shown here by Faithkeeper Oren Lyons, depicts the paths of a canoe and a ship traveling side by side, each following their own route, neither interfering in the affairs of the other. These expectations of appropriate conduct informed decisions during the Revolution and remain important sites of knowledge and organizing today. The decades before the American Revolutionary War were a crucial time of evolving alliances and strategies among Native nations themselves and with various European powers and local colonial representatives. There was no single story here. Instead, I would emphasize that Native nations leaders consulted and made decisions shaped by a multitude of local and wider factors and needs. For instance, a Mohawk leader named Hendrik Deonogwin played a key role in a political and military alliance with the British, maintaining the covenant chain of responsibilities that bound together these peoples in the Northeast. As you might imagine, once tensions began to build within the British Empire to the point of impending revolution by the 1770s, Mohawk people confronted possibilities for continuing these arrangements or dramatically changing them. The 1750s and 60s, so here the whole lead up to the revolution is enormously important, were also significant for the large numbers of Native men who participated in military service during the 7 Years' War. Huge proportions of communities traveled far from home, both on land and by sea. Many lost their lives or suffered grievous injury. These experiences and losses were strongly remembered within Native nations and informed their actions in the years that followed. Native veterans included people like Pickett, who returned to coastal Connecticut after the 7 Years' War and made a living producing and selling wooden wares like these items. I'll shift now to touching briefly upon several key people and moments in the Northeast during the Revolution itself. You may be familiar with the iconic day of March 5th, 1770, the so-called Boston Massacre, depicted here by Paul Revere. When British troops stationed in the city fired upon a crowd of townspeople, including many working-class laborers, Crispus Attucks was among the first casualties. A Native and African-American man, his death and those of others in the streets that bloody day became a point of great mourning and political rallying by critics of the British government. And these were dangerous times. For Native people living, working, and traveling among kin and intertribal networks, risks grew of being harmed or detained or seized and imprisoned as colonists became suspicious of their loyalties. And this was shaped by many, many years of anti-Indigenous sentiments and policies. Joseph Johnson, a Mohegan citizen and preacher of the gospel, secured this written passport from the New York Provincial Congress in 1775. He could show the paper, which described his good works and Christian faith, to people he met in his travels from Oneida to New London, in hopes that it would guarantee his safe passage and those of 3 Native traveling companions. Johnson eventually died in unknown circumstances during the war years, leaving behind a grieving family. Native nations figured in prominent ways in international diplomacy as the revolution got underway. Shortly after the United States declared independence in 1776, the new country sought to establish formal relations with foreign nations as a way of strengthening its stature and articulating its standing on the global stage. The first such treaty negotiated was with the Wabanaki nations in the Treaty of Watertown. Wabanaki representatives made the long journey south to Watertown, Massachusetts, where they spoke at length during detailed discussions about how their nations and the U.S. might relate. They emphasized the need for the United States to recognize their sovereignty and provide specific resources and trading sites to Wabanaki people. This treaty remains a vital issue today. Native nations and individuals made strategic decisions about how to align themselves or try to remain neutral during what many referred to as a civil war between Euro-colonial brothers. To take one example, Daniel Nunsuch from Nahantic on the north side of Long Island Sound identified an opportunity to cross the Sound and share intelligence with the British then occupying the island. He reported out key details about American resources, positions, and fortifications in coastal Connecticut, particularly New London area. This informed the eventual 1781 attack by British forces that severely damaged that stretch of coastline. And Nunsuch had his reasons for aligning, at least provisionally, in this way. Many Native men served in military units in the course of the war. Among the motivations for enlisting were protecting their own homelands, as well as opportunities to earn wages as income, which was becoming ever more urgent as colonial dispossession undermined Native lands and resources. Payments for military service often wound up being delayed or missing altogether, however. Anthony Jeremiah, perhaps from one of the Wampanoag nations or a neighboring Native nation, was one such participant. He signed onto the multiracial crew of John Paul Jones's ship Ranger that launched from the Piscataqua shipyards in 1777 and traveled transatlantically in pursuit of prizes at sea. He may have drawn upon long-standing Native whaling traditions when he took up this role as a mariner. During soldiers' and sailors' long absences from home, Native women, children, and elders did tremendous work sustaining their nations and safeguarding their homes. Hendrik Oppermott, a Mohican leader, spoke to these immensely difficult conditions in this petition to Americans for support. It noted that in the wake of the loss of many young men in battle, quote, their widows are now left to care of themselves and their children without help from their husbands, who at this season of the year provided for their families by hunting. The petition appealed to colonists' hearts to request blankets and clothing for the Mohican families. And as a final note to conclude on, I wanted to share briefly some reflections on Ruth Waukheat and her family. A Native woman from Nahantic, she knew the immense challenges of providing for family during wartime. She was listed as a widow in various documents by the 1760s, like many other adult Native women. By the time the Revolutionary War was well underway, she was living at least part-time in Killingworth, Connecticut, perhaps to earn wages in domestic or other labor. She had a young son named Aaron. In summer 1782, she entered into this agreement with a prominent Connecticut colonist to bind out her beloved son into his household. This agreement was hardly freely chosen. It reflected generations of colonial taking of Native people, especially children, to toil as enslaved or indentured workers for colonial benefit. Thus, 9-year-old Aaron was sent to New Haven, Connecticut to work for Ezra Stiles, president of Yale College. Aaron spent nearly a year there alongside an African-American family named the Freemans. The most important part of this story may be the fact that is confirmed in this document from the Yale archives that Ruth reclaimed her son in the spring of 1783. She exercised her maternal agency to remove him from colonial bondage and pressures to assimilate to European ways and return him to their network of relations at a time still replete with challenges and uncertainty. Ruth and Aaron then formed part of the generations that would move their nations through the post-war period and into a future tremendously changed. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you, Christine, for starting us off with a wide view. I'm going to get a little bit more narrow, and I'm going to do a very more specific, tight view of the Revolutionary War. You guys get to see my grandbaby right there. But I wanted to share, I work with Robert Geek of Rhode Island historian, and we wrote the book together, From Slaves to Soldiers, the First Rhode Island Regiment in the American Revolution. And so I'm going to share a little bit about the First Rhode Island Regiment, which is noted as the first integrated regiment in the Revolutionary War. And so this happens to be a portrait that was done by Don Triani, that's called Brave Men as Ever Fought. And it's depicting this integrated regiment in Yorktown. Uh, and I think that's really important because often Indigenous people and African descended people are left out of the visual narrative of these historical events, and so I think this is an important piece that's added to the story. So, who served? There was a temporary law that was put on the books in Rhode Island that allowed for African and Indigenous men to serve in the war. And it was a temporary measure. They didn't want to give them arms and allow them to be part of the war. But the reality is, at this point in time, they were not winning the war and they needed more able bodied men. Sometimes these men were put into this position because the slave owner only had one son and didn't want to send the son, but they had to send someone from the household. And so there was lots of things like that going on, but there was also other reasons that they would want to do that. So there was an act allowing Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves to go into the war. But I do like to point out that everyone that was Black or Indigenous were not enslaved that also served in this regiment and in the war. Even though the book title is From Slaves to Soldiers, it's a bit of a misnomer that just sells books. So they joined Continental battalions, and many free men were enlisted. And the official, and I'm going to do that loosely, is 225 men in the regiment. And I say loosely because they moved around. Sometimes they were in the regiment, sometimes they would fall into another regiment, sometimes they would come back to this regiment. But the data shows that there was possibly over 75 Indigenous men in this regiment. And I think that's really important. I really push about the number because this regiment has often been dubbed the Black Regiment or the Colored Regiment. And in doing so, it totally erases the Indigenous men that were within the regiment. And I think it's really important to realize that it wasn't just like there was one or two or five or 10, but possibly 75 out of 225 that were Indigenous men. And I think that's really important for people to think about and to understand that there was a large contingent of Indigenous men in this particular regiment. And as we just spoke with Christine, that also served throughout the Revolutionary War in other regiments. Even in Rhode Island, there was the 1st Rhode Island, the 2nd Rhode Island, and then other regiments in which Indigenous men were in. But this is certainly the most popular. So why did they serve? Ananau is the word service in Narragansett. And it's 100 years since the War for New England, what you might know of as King Philip's War. We decolonized that because it really was a war to break the power of sovereignty in this place that is now known as New England. Their goal was to create this New England. And so there's a lot happening here. Indigenous people are being enslaved in the Caribbean and other islands. They're being pushed north, south, east, and west out of their homelands. And there's this displacement and forced assimilative practices that's happening. And so people decide to serve in the war for a lot of reasons. One of them is straight up survival. There's a lot of disruption to their lives that are happening over this last 100 years. And so survival, it gives them food. It gives them potentially a livelihood. It didn't always work out well for them, but nonetheless, there was also this sense of honor. In the Indigenous communities, there's these warrior societies and this idea of being a warrior as being very honored and respected because they did and gave for the community. And in this way, service in the military is a continuation of that honor, this idea of warriors' honor and that they would care for themselves. I've talked to many people who served like in World War I and World War II during my lifetime. And one of the things that they said of why they serve is that this was their homeland. So you could imagine that those same feelings about this place being their homeland was important to the people that served at that time. But there was a lot of dynamics going on. There's not one singular reason why someone decides to serve. But there was all these complications. In some ways, there were some communities that were siding with the British, and in this area, the idea was, well, if they're throwing off the yoke of tyranny of Great Britain, and we've been feeling that tyranny for the last 100 years, maybe if we join with them, then that would give us this success and this ability to move forward. And so those are some of the reasons, not all of the reasons why someone might serve. This is a story of General Washington. So Simeon Simons, he was this indigenous man that went to Dartmouth, had his degree from Dartmouth in 1777. He joined the Continental Troops. And in his service, he ended up with a lot of other people over in Patchogue, Connecticut, to greet General Washington. And in the end, he became the life's guardsman for General Washington. And a lot of us in this region, there's lots of people we know that are directly connected to this Simons line. And in the Narragansett, in the Pequot community, maybe even in the Mohegan community as well. And so it's just very interesting that this story, which had been an oral history story that has been passed down for generations, has actually ended up in documentation in different places. And I think it shows the respect and the amount of service that people have. One of the things that people often don't know is that Indigenous people have the highest number per capita of service in the U.S. Armed Forces since the beginning of this country through today. And that service has been ongoing, and yet we don't often get the respect for that service. You know, we did that service, but we don't necessarily get the honors for it. Um, and so I think that when I think of like the Declaration of Independence, that's supposed to be something that you're fighting for, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, how that's denied us despite the fact that Indigenous people were here right at the very beginning. And instead they signed it and created all this propaganda and called us merciless Indian savages whose known rules of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Those are things that are written into this founding document that creates this country. And I remember talking to students and they're like, well, why can't we just change it? Well, as much as we'd like to, you can't change the Declaration of Independence. But it shows that despite the fact that they were giving their lives, they were giving their liberty, they were giving of themselves as warriors, they were still not treated with the same level of respect. So after the war, um, we have a lot of conversations about what happened to Indigenous people after the war, because it's interesting. They come into the war and they're documented as they go in, but there's not a lot of documentation of when they go home. We know people returned home. There's different quotes. The Noke quote that talks about, that his grandfather served in the war honorably, and then after many years came home and lived and died here, on his homeland. Very few people got pensions. There were widows that got the pension when they were in their 90s, that showed that there was this truth of this service, but it took a long time. Most of the men died before they ever got any pension. There's also this conflict going on, not only within the colonial communities, but also within the native communities. As these men were off at war, sometimes they were losing land to those that were there and still at home. There was also identity loss, where people would go into the military as Indigenous And as they were going out of the military, they would write musty, Negro, black, whatever the term was of the day, and erase their indigeneity on these permanent documents. There's one story where an indigenous man married what was documented as a colored woman. And when he married her, it changed his identity to colored. And so there's all of this that's happening as a lead up to other wars like the Civil War and the things that were happening in the 1800s and the 1900s that are a direct effect of what's happening at this time. So there's lots of remembrances that go on. There's reenactments of the First Rhode Island Regiment. There's a children's book, which is dubbed the Black Regiment, which, as I mentioned, is a form of erasure of Indigenous people within the regiment. The book that I worked with Robert Geek on, From Slaves to Soldiers, the First Rhode Island Regiment and the American Revolution. And then, of course, there's films and exhibits. We will be having an exhibit at Tamaqua Museum. It will open in mid-April, and it's called Revolution to Reclamation. And it will tie in all the things in much more depth than I just said in this little 8 to 10 minute introduction of the before the war, the Revolutionary War, and the effects after the war. So I think those are all really important, and they help to tell truths that are out there. One, that people of color in general, Black and Indigenous, were in this war. That is often something that is left out. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that didn't have any idea that there were people of color in this war. And I try to remind people all the time, there is absolutely no U.S. history without Indigenous people's history. It's all interwoven in that time. And if you're going to speak to Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, there's no state's history without the First Peoples' history there. And so we want to continue to honor the people that serve, that are Indigenous, and to remind people of the amount of service. So this is just a little blurb. Obviously, there's not lots of pictures from the Revolutionary War, but I do like to show that there's this continuation of honor and respect as warriors and warrior societies, and the importance of that. And one of our tribal women, who's way up in the military, showing that she's a veteran and in her traditional clothes. So showing it over time in the Civil War and all the wars, World War I, World War II, all the way up to today. And so in order to honor those things, that past that has been erased, we work together with a big team of people brought to us by Charlie Smith, whose father was a veteran and Indigenous and was buried in the Rhode Island Veterans Cemetery. And he realized that there was no monument to Indigenous veterans. And so we set about over 2 years in the middle of the pandemic to fundraise for this monument that was so great to see. The two people that actually have their hands on the scissors, they were in their mid-90s when this was done. He's no longer with us, but she's quite elderly now. And all of these people are veterans, and there were many others that came and went, but these were the veterans that were there at the ribbon cutting to honor those veterans. So I'll pause there. There's always so much to say and so little time to say it.
Thank you so much, Lorén. So we now have a little bit of a discussion we'll have between the two of us, and then open it up for questions from people attending with about 15 minutes for that. Lorén, so much we could touch on here, but I wanted to start with a question about sovereignty and Native nations, Native polities, Native self-determination, and why this is so crucial, not only in the 18th century, but also right into the 21st century and the future, and how this may add some layers of understanding or transform understandings of seemingly known events like the revolution. Could you tell us a little bit in your view and in the work that you do, and in your own lived experience, how sovereignty comes into these issues and why it still matters so much?
Certainly. Well, I think that sovereignty is so important in this because one of the things that people just don't seem to understand is that Indigenous people are not just another group of people, they're sovereign governments. Just as a state is a domestic sovereign to the United States today, like the state of Massachusetts or the state of Rhode Island is a domestic sovereign to the United States, tribal nations are domestic sovereigns today. And that's really hard for people to understand because they're like, well, we're this group of people or we're that group of people. It should be the same. And it's not based on those nation to nation relationships that we had in the colonial governments that then transcend down to the British government, to the colonial governments, to our federal government, and then sometimes with relationships with state government. Um, but federally recognized tribal nations have a nation to nation relationship with the US federal government, and they've been asserting their sovereignty this whole entire time. So, as a Narragansett citizen, I'm a dual citizen of the United States and the Narragansett Nation. And so, and you could even say a tri if you want to include your state as well. So, the the importance of sovereignty and something that's been consistently and pervasively fought for is their rights as sovereigns. And so even as King Philip's War happens, they're asserting their sovereignty. As we lead up into the Revolutionary War, people are asserting their sovereignty as governments. For my own nation, the dissolution, if you will, of our government didn't happen till 1880 to 1882 in the detribalization rolls. But we proved after 100 years that even though they did it on paper, we still were a government and we were still fighting for that sovereignty. So that sovereignty continues to today, to the 21st century. And I think that, there's sovereignty as the nation, an indigenous tribal nation, and that nation to nation relationship and work that's happening. But there's also things today that we call cultural sovereignty or sovereignty of the mind, body, and spirit as Indigenous people, that we also individually have rights as Indigenous people, the right to language and spirituality and cultural knowledge and access to resources for hunting, fishing, gathering, and all kinds of other traditional life ways that are intrinsic in who we are. And yet, over these 400 years, if we go from all of colonization time periods, there's been this constant and pervasive fight for these rights. And that sovereignty is that fighting for it. There's all these different legal documents where our communities are writing and using the courts that they are using against us. We're actually fighting back and using it against them as well. And so that's how, things like federal recognition happen, and how the Indian Child Welfare Act happens, and the Indigenous Religious Freedom Act happens, and the Indian Reorganization Act. I could go on forever. There's all these different federal acts that take place because Indigenous people were asserting, and their governments were asserting their sovereignty and their rights to be Indigenous nations. And so they continue to do that, and we continue to fight for those rights and those access points. That's a challenge. It can still be a challenge in the 21st century because so many things have changed, and create difficulty for, sovereignty. I'll give an example of a difficulty. It's very difficult to practice traditional whaling knowledges uh, knowledge of the ceremonies before, the ceremonies during, the techniques and strategies for hunting a whale when the whale population was decimated in the Atlantic, and that blocks our rights to those knowledges. But we continue with many other knowledges and continue with many other uh, rights that we continue to fight for and have access to.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this, right? And how many different layers and dimensions there are of sovereignty. You're reminding me of a terrific exhibition down at the National Museum of the American Indian on nation to nation and treaties and diplomacy that people might be interested in if it's still up. And your point about whaling brings me to another question. I was wondering if you might offer some reflections about place as you were speaking about the work that citizens were doing, both in military capacities and those who stayed at home during many of these campaigns. Land and water are so significant to how people are traveling, to the knowledge they have, to maintaining their homes and their livelihoods during this time of just immense upheaval and starvation and resource deprivation. Uh, and also in the background of all this, but very live, is the ongoing dispossession, right, and resistance to having lands taken. So any thoughts you might have about place and some of the particular parts of these homelands that are really crucial to people's experiences during the revolution or in a broader context?
Yeah, so that's complicated in a lot of ways. So first, we are the people of a particular place, right? That's what indigenous means. So everything about us is connected to this place. Our lifeways, our food sources, our ceremonies, our language, everything is connected to this place. And when I think about the Revolutionary War, one, it's already 100 years after the War for New England, and we're already being dispossessed of place. So think of the trading ports, Boston, Providence, Cocomasusset, Cove. Those are all places that are great trading places. Those become the same places that are great places for diplomacy. They're great places to send off people to war. You think of Aquidneck Island, everybody knows about Newport. That's a war space that was used readily in the Revolutionary War. And when people say, oh, Narragansett people or indigenous people aren't on the island, one, I tell them, yes, they are. They're there. You just can't see them because they're swallowed into a larger population. But the part of the dispossession is because they needed these places as forts and as war garrisons and things like that. And so they start pushing people out of those places that they need for this war effort. There's also the taking of resources that comes from these wars as well. Ships need a lot of wood. Throughout the colonial time period, they just kept cutting the trees until there were none because they needed those for warships and cargo ships and all of those kinds of things. And this is all part of that. And it becomes part of the changes in the land and the dispossession of those resources. It becomes the destruction of spaces as well. When these coastal spaces become war spaces, they're not treated with respect for harvest. And they're treated completely differently. And that's true all around the region. There's all this dispossession of access to places because the use is being transformed for the war, for economy, sometimes the economy of war, and sometimes just the economy in general that needs to survive also while the war is going on. There's this constant dispossession of land and resources, and literally every generation, it gets worse and worse on our access to these resources. And each generation impacts the next generation on resources, but it also created this level of poverty within the indigenous communities because of the lack of access to the resources. I mean, it's still happening today. COVID created a new dispossession of land because it created land costs going really skyrocket for places that are more rural or town-like versus urban. And it creates this situation where houses that just before COVID were, let's say, 250, that are now 500 to 750, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I say that because indigenous people are getting systematically removed again from their homelands because they can't afford the next iteration of cost increases in these gentrification strategies that happen over multiple time periods and continue to impact us today.
What you were saying here is some of the most powerful work that I have been able to learn from at Tamaqua Museum, connecting the past and the present, that this is not about the 18th century in some isolation. It is these through lines and structures and processes. So thank you for that really rich answer. I think I have time for one or two more questions for us. When we hear phrases that are a lot in the commemorations of America 250 and the Revolution anniversary, phrases like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, liberty and equality for all. Uh, how do those look different when we put them into a context like the work that you have just shared? And in particular, I'm thinking of some of the collaborative public humanities work you've done with the Stolen Relations Project around enslavement, indentured servitude, and the really relentless colonial taking of life and labor and knowledge and futures. Uh, and this may be very new to people in this region or others who are already very, very familiar. How might you bring that work into this conversation about an era that is now being celebrated in all kinds of ways as in a more simple fashion? What kind of complexities would you want?
Well, first I serve on the 250 Commission. I'm the education chair in Rhode Island. And I think that my whole goal, what I do in my life and my day life, is education. It's about telling the stories that are maybe hidden and untold. And so I think that it's really important for people to find the untold stories. We're commemorating the 250th anniversary of the founding of this nation. But we all know that the founding, quote unquote, is on the backs and lives of indigenous people and also African descended people. Our collaboration with Entwined Freedom, Sovereignty, in the Sea over at Mystic Seaport with Brown and Williams and a whole lot of other people. That exhibit was talking about that intersectionality of these stories and how the creating of what is now known as New England doesn't exist without Indigenous and Black stories. And so I think that when I think about your question about the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, we did a whole exhibit quite a few years back called The Pursuit of Happiness. And it looked at all the ways it was denied us throughout history. How the denial of our own physical bodies, the denial of our own lives, the denial of our political right to be a nation, the denial of land and access to fishing and water rights, the denial of all these various things, religious rights and cultural knowledge, and the list goes on. But then we also did the flip side of that, how we pursue it today, right? Because and throughout time, not just today, there's been this ongoing pursuit to protect our lives, to protect our lifeways, to honor our ancestors, to continue our cultural knowledge, to continue our language, continue our ways of knowing. Um, all of those things are ongoing. And so the pursuit of happiness is something that we as Indigenous people continue to do by asserting our sovereignty, by continuing all of those important things that we think are important. My mother would come, her grandchildren will be standing around doing whatever grandchildren do, right? And then she's like, "Oh, by the way, and she'll name one of them. Can you go sing this song for me? Can you lead this dance for me?" And that's what she did all my life too. And what do you say to your grandparent? You just say yes and do it because they're your grandparent. You might not to your parents, but you never say no to your grandparent. And so that's that continuation, and that's that pursuing your life, right? My grandson Minakisu, who's 7, one, he has a traditional name, Minakisu Mikwin. This is something that started during the civil rights era, where people were reclaiming their right to use Indigenous names on their birth certificates, and it's gone much more. There's a lot of kids with Indigenous words in our own language. And my grandson has a t-shirt. It says, "Yes, I'm a boy and I have braids." you know that's the kind of thing of pursuing your happiness. Why is it that he can't have braids and be a boy? That's the thing. It's an ongoing pursuit. We are always defending our rights and fighting for them. We're having issues around access to salt ponds as they've gone from commodifying the land to now commodifying the water. It's creating new blocks of access to resources and things that we've always done, that we're now getting blocked in various places and not having access to do. And of course, all Americans are being blocked, but this is our ancestral lifeways that we're trying to continue forward over generations.
I think we can transition to some audience questions now. So thanks, Lorén and Christine. And we have a question saying, "I'm wondering if there is a record or speculation on how Indigenous communities might have viewed their members fighting in wars brought on from outside influences, or if there was tension within communities regarding people leaving their lands on behalf of this service."
Yeah, there's definitely, if you think about any kind of conflict, there's always going to be people that have different opinions of how that should be handled. And there was conflict. Some people didn't think that they should go into the war. People thought they should stay neutral in some places. Other people thought that they should fight with the British, and other people thought they should fight with the Americans. And so it is complicated, because I think if you think of it this way, if a war broke out tomorrow and we had to pick a side, whatever that side was, that's complicated. You don't know all the things. You don't know all the ramifications. Like, you don't know how it's going to end in the end, right? And people have to make those decisions on the spot. No different than in World War II, when people had to make the decisions to help Jewish families hide and transfer them over to someplace else. People had to take a risk. And some people didn't want to take the risk, and so they just did nothing. And then other people were doing the horror things, and other people, because they thought that was going to help them and their family. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that people make decisions based on what they know at that moment and what they think is going to help them at that moment. Anything to add to that, Christine?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and I'm reminded of how many accounts there are from the time of deliberations and really difficult conversations within nations about what the best course of action is, including the option of trying to stay neutral in this war between brothers, right? A real sense from some that this is English, British folks fighting among themselves. It's for them to work out, not to have others brought into this. I'm also reminded of in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, there are, there are distinct alliances that are chosen there that present great challenges to that confederacy that has been so cohesive for many generations. And also keeping in mind that by the 1770s, right, nations have experienced so much loss already through a series of previous wars going way back into the 17th century, and also epidemic disease that is just massive, massive effects and loss of life and destabilization. And that's on people's minds as they're thinking, as Lorén is saying, about what decisions are going to be the best to secure their community. It really strikes me as it's not about abstract ideology. It's about very complicated factors that are coming into people's decisions.
We have a lot of questions about women in the chat. People are asking, was it more difficult for Indigenous widows to collect pensions, or did any Indigenous women fight in these battles?
So my understanding is no Indigenous women fought in the battles because no women, period, fought in the battles. Although women were often taken along because, unlike the military today, they didn't have the military machine that happens, and people had to get fed and people had to get resources. So there were people around them, bringing things places. But as far as the pensions, it was very difficult for the women to get pensions. One of the stories that I can recall, they had to get a lot of letters saying about his good service. Like they needed to get like the military higher ups to actually send letters on behalf of the widow in regards to their husband's service in order for them to even get in the queue to potentially get a pension. It was very difficult, and some of the men not only didn't get a pension but got re-enslaved. Both Indigenous and Black men got re-enslaved, which is just egregious when in some cases they went in the war to get freed. One story I know, they were freed in Rhode Island, but then after the war were said they were owned in Massachusetts. So like they went into the war in Rhode Island and then said they were owned in Massachusetts and then got re-enslaved. So it's a lot of those kinds of things.
And I'm thinking of the film produced by Mohegan that I mentioned, Up and Down the River. There's a really strong through line there about Mohegan women and kind of encounters with colonialism that is organized along much more paternalistic and patriarchal lines and the challenges this presents, and also perspectives of some women, what would happen if their relations went away to war and never returned home? What would those impacts be? And all of that is very vivid in that film and can be found in various ways in other types of knowledge. I'm thinking of the pension files too, just how long some of those are. They go on and on and on. It's sometimes grandchildren, right? It's generations out before they manage to secure something that was due to people that people had been promised as compensation for their service. So thank you for that question.
The Above and the Below film can be found right on the Mohegan tribe's website too. It's a phenomenal film. They're going to be showing that at Yale too during that conference coming up.
Speaking of great resources, we have some teachers in the audience, and they're wondering if you have suggestions on, things to bring into the curriculum or advice for teachers that are interested in teaching this history.
So I would say check out the Rhode Island 250 website. I think it's ri250.org off the top of my head, but something to that effect. Because we have some education page resources there, and we've been actually doing curriculum workshops for teachers over the last 2 years. So there's also those are filmed in some capacity, so those are evergreen resources as well. And even I'm in one of them. I mean, I tried to do my talk in 10 minutes and it's normally an hour. So so there's a lot of depth if you rewatch. There's other layers to the story that can be added. And there was other resources there as well. Do you have another suggestion, Christine, of where they can find some more
Yeah,
resources?
I'm thinking of there's a if you were able to travel up to the Abbey Museum in Wabanaki Homelands, they have a brilliant new exhibition, I think in the Shadow of the Eagle, that features a lot about the revolutionary experience and has many contemporary artists and culture bearers work up there. I had a chance to see that this past summer, and it was really phenomenal. And I'm also thinking of primary sources. When I teach undergraduate students, I try to bring in as many original accounts so that students can spend time with people's words from the time and see what they were saying and how they were discussing and reflecting and debating things. There's an edited collection edited by Colin Calloway, I believe, titled The World Turned Upside Down, that has a lot of primary sources by and about Indigenous people in this era. And I've used that a number of times.
We have a couple of specific questions about soldiers, so I'll try to combine a few. We have people asking if there were any mixed race soldiers in this regiment, Black and Indigenous descent, or if there were, or what the experience of soldiers were like, if they were equally compensated and how they were treated.
So they were not equally compensated nor equally treated. There is potential that there may have been some biracial folks. I don't know that answer for sure. Um, on like I don't have the genealogy sort of the people that were in the regiment. Right now, it's really hard just to even come by the information in the regiment. It's not super easy information. Um, I'm trying to think if I have any other answer than that. I don't think so. At the moment, I'm doing two things at once because I was trying to put the Tamaquag website, but the webinar chat is not to the folks. So
Mm.
maybe if you can share that. It has so our theme is we have a theme all year long of reb- revolution reclamation to revolution to reclamation, I think. And the theme I got it. The theme for book club, revolution asserting sovereignty. So that's the education team's theme all year, revolution asserting sovereignty. So that's through our lunch and learns, which I think we had to postpone Linford Fisher's, but he's going to be doing the revolutionary resistance and stealing of America, a professor out of Brown. He was supposed to do it this past Monday, but there was a storm in case you didn't notice. And so a lot of things got postponed. But we have lunch and learn monthly throughout the year, and it's all on that theme. We have book club for the next 3 months that's on that theme. And then in April, our exhibit, Revolution to Reclamation, will open. And so there'll be more things in regards to that. The other thing I was thinking when someone was saying about resources is just to check in, even if someone's not museums and historical sites, a lot of them are doing things, but if they're on the smaller side, sometimes they're not as quick at getting the information out there. And then I was thinking of also the PBS um, curriculum site that they often have the films that they do. They have associated curriculum and short interstitials that go with it. We did that with some other films for them a few years back, but I'm imagining with the Ken Burns film being playing on PBS that they're doing some kind of curriculum there. I'd be shocked if they weren't.
Mhm.
So you might check there. I just haven't checked myself.
You also had a question. You had mentioned the land loss when soldiers went to went to fight. So people were wondering if you had more to say about those stories and if people were able to reclaim their land.
Yeah, so some of it was that there was no one there to protect their land. So then other people come in, meaning colonial people, and create uh, uh, like a system where you owe something, like the taxation kind of thing. And if there's not someone there to do it, then that's a way to do a land grab and to grab that land. But there were also conflicts within Native communities sometimes on who was there for those lands, especially as lands are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. That becomes a conflict as well. So it shows the amount of land loss that Indigenous communities have had over this whole time, and it's devastating to people, and that continues to create the conflicts that people have today is over land and the loss of land and resources.
Well, thank you so much, Lorén and Christine, and I'm going to invite Lisa back to have some closing remarks.
Thank you, Lauren and Christine, for this really thoughtful discussion illuminating lesser known experiences of Indigenous individuals, families, and nations during the Revolution. And thank you to our audience for watching tonight. Programs such as this are possible to the support provided by friends like you. And the MHS has some very special events coming up in the next few months. So information about upcoming programs can be found on the Society's website at www.masthis.org. Thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful evening.